KidMissing TV. This is our first anniversary, which makes me very excited. And I want to thank you all for watching this past year. This past year has been a dream come true for me. This episode is entitled Missing in New England. Each of these cases were representative for New England state, although not Rhode Island because there wasn't any. Tammy Lynn Belanger was 8 years old when she went missing on November 13th, 1984 from Exeter, New Hampshire. She was walking to school. She had to walk by the Phillips Exeter Academy, and police still hope that people who attended the academy will come forward if they saw anything. I assume this academy might have been a college. The street that she was on was called Court Street, and it actually led right through downtown Exeter, and if you kept going, you could go straight out of New Hampshire into Massachusetts from there. So whoever took this little girl could have taken her anywhere from there. There was one suspect in Tammy's case, a Victor Wanyetyi. He was an auto body repairman, and he was named by the police as a suspect, although there was no physical evidence against Mr. Wanyetyi. The police said, quote, "There was no one else that really rose to his level. He was the one that committed that crime." I'm not sure why they say that. I'm not seeing it. He died in December of 2012 in a Florida prison hospital. He was serving time on a parole violation after serving more than 20 years on burglary related convictions. That doesn't rise to the level of kidnapping a child. Except that they seem to think that his death would bring up more leads in Tammy's case, which it didn't. They're following up on anything he might have said or written or left behind in an attempt to find out more information as to his involvement, the officer said. I think they've got blinders on. We all do this from time to time. You get tunnel vision and you just focus. And I think that's what they're doing in this case, and I think it's doing a disservice to Tammy and to her family, because I don't think an auto body repair guy who's a thief necessarily fits the profile of a child kidnapping pedophile. So, just think they're barking up the wrong tree. The phone number for Tammy Belanger is the New Hampshire State Police, 603-271-2663. Wilfredo Torres was 9 years old when he disappeared from the Upham's Corner section of Dorchester, Massachusetts, which is a suburb of Boston, on May 9th, 1983. He was a student at Hennigan Elementary School in Jamaica Plain. Boston police scoured Upham's Corner looking for this little boy. As a matter of fact, 50 National Guardsmen combed sections of Dorchester and Roxbury on the 16th. The search was finally called off by Police Commissioner Joseph Jordan, and he added the case to the missing persons files. I think the case should have been added to the missing persons files to begin with, but anyway. The only trace of him was a pair of black nylon sneakers that were found during the searches that his mother identified as being Wilfredo's. It was the most intensive police and National Guard search for a missing child since 1977, when the South End girl disappeared and was never found. Wilfredo has a disability a learning disability, although it's not stated exactly how severe this disability is or exactly what this disability is. The phone number for information in the case of Wilfredo Torres is the Boston Police Department at 617-343-4200. Connie Smith was 10 years old when she vanished from summer camp, Camp Sloan in Salisbury, Connecticut, on July 16, 1952. Connie was from Wyoming. Connie was completely different than the other girls at camp and had trouble getting along. The other girls at camp were kind of New York City slicker girls, and she was a country girl. She rode horses. They rode the subway. And they had fought. After visiting day, which was the day before, and she had seen her mom, and she had gotten a bloody nose. She never told anybody about that. She only went and got an ice pack when she fell on the platform in the tent and hurt her hip. At least that's the story she told. Whether that had to do with the fight or not, who knows? When Connie initially left the camp, she just walked out. She was a very self-assured young lady. She had no problem asking people. Many people said, yeah, she asked us how to get to, I think she was trying to get to the center of town. And many people said she asked them. And nobody thought anything of it when she left the camp because she was a very tall little girl, so people thought she was a camp counselor, thought she was a teenager. This was a 10-year-old child, but she was 5 feet tall. But then, that's not odd considering the fact that her father was about a 6'7" Jolly Green Giant. So, and in fact, this is one of the first cases that ever got national attention because her father actually went on the Art Linkletter show and talked about his daughter's case. It also got so much attention because her grandfather, Nels Smith, was at one time the governor of the great state of Wyoming. So they took it pretty seriously when she disappeared from camp because, uh-oh, this is the governor's granddaughter. The Connecticut State Police were in charge and still are in charge of this investigation. Her father flew in from Wyoming and basically took over. He was there, him and his former wife, in spite of the fact that they were divorced, worked together to try to find their daughter. She died several years later of a heart attack, they say of a broken heart. Because of her daughter's death. Her father, however, lived until 2012, and he was 95 years old, I believe. The only real lead, well, actually there were 2 leads, but one of them was a convict stated that he had murdered her. And it took him from his cell in the penitentiary, and he brought him to where he said he put her, and then he said, well, I enjoyed being out, but no, I didn't really kill her. I also thought maybe gypsies had taken her. Her grandfather went and interviewed gypsies, and that went nowhere. The best lead, in 1958, a young girl's remains were found near Williams, Arizona. Police to this day have not identified this young lady. She's known as Little Miss X. And they went to get Connie's dentals. And compare them to her, and it was an inconclusive comparison. So they would like to compare her DNA. Unfortunately, somehow, authorities don't remember where they buried the remains of Little Miss X. So that can't happen. How do you forget where you buried the remains of a victim? And also, some suspicions have fallen on a William Henry Redmond, who was charged with the 1951 murder of a young girl, and suspected in cases like the famous case of Beverly Potts, which is Cleveland's oldest open missing child case. He allegedly confessed to at least 4 murders, but there was no evidence linking him to Connie, and I don't think there's any real evidence linking him to Beverly either. I had the opportunity to interview Michael C. Dooling, who wrote a book called Clueless in New England about 3 cases. The Connie Smith case, the case of Paula Jean Weldon, which we'll get to later in the program, and another case of a young lady who was found, but she was found murdered. And he believes there may be some sort of connection between the 3 cases. I read the book. I loved the book. So I got a hold of the author and I had him on my radio show. What I'd like to do now is play you a clip of him talking about Connie's case. And later when we're talking about Paula's case, I'll play that clip for you.
But that Connie, as I said, disappeared one day, was seen hitchhiking along Route 44 in Connecticut, apparently had an argument with her tent mates at camp, and was heading to the center of Lakeville, Connecticut, which is a very small town, and wanted to make a phone call home, probably. And she was seen by 6 or so people on the way, and then at one intersection she disappeared.
The phone number in the Connie Smith case is the Connecticut State Police, Western District Major Crimes, 860-567-6875, or the Salisbury, Connecticut Police Department at 860-435-2938. This one here is kind of one of my pet cases. This is Angelo Puglisi, known as Andy. Andy was 10 years old when he disappeared on August 21st, 1976, from Lawrence, Massachusetts. He was out at the pool at his apartment complex with his friends and just vanished. There's a picture I'd like to show you. It's Andy and his baby sister. It's a picture that no one ever saw until after his disappearance because the film was still sitting in his mother's camera and wasn't developed until after. So it's the last picture his baby sister has of her brother and herself. Kind of sad, actually. This case has 2 main suspects, both of whom, just stomach-churning individuals. Charles Pierce was a resident of Haverhill, and he's long been considered a prime suspect, as has Wayne Chapman. Pierce was a pedophile who was abducting and doing horrible things to children during that time period, but his focus seemed to be on females. Chapman, on the other hand, was arrested in Waterloo, New York on August 27th, 1976, 6 days after Andy disappeared, for the rape of 2 boys that were raped in the woods right next to the pool where Andy disappeared. That makes him a much better suspect as far as I'm concerned. In his car, things that were discovered were disturbing, to say the least. They found a cache of kiddie porn, rope, tape, handcuffs, a fake police badge, a starter's pistol. That's just scary. A young boy at the time said that they had come across a pit, a dug up hole, again in the woods just beyond the pool, that looked like it could have been big enough for someone to get into. And when they brought the police back there, the hole had been filled in, and when the police dug it up, there was nothing there. So they weren't sure if something was ever there or not. They excavated the area again in 1999, and still found nothing. I'm going to give you a little bit of a timeline, kind of go through it fast, because there's no need to dwell on each little thing. In 1975, in August, is when the two boys, aged 10 and 11, were lured into the woods and raped by Chapman. Chapman was charged with sodomizing several children in a 4-H club in Providence, Rhode Island as well. He was charged in the murder of 6-year-old David Lewison, who was missing from Brockton, Massachusetts in 1974. When police initially searched the Brockton area for the boy, they never found him, so they weren't able to pursue the case, because they didn't pursue cases without bodies back then. In October of 1976 is when he was publicly named as a suspect in Andy's case. In November, Governor Dukakis signed a warrant for extradition for Wayne W. Chapman from Rhode Island to Massachusetts in the rape of the two Lawrence boys. And the Bristol County grand jury indicted him on these counts. He was found guilty in September of 1977 of these charges. He was sentenced to 15 to 30 years at the MCI Center, Cedar Junction, which is the Massachusetts Correctional Institution. In 1978, he is civilly committed to the Massachusetts Treatment Center for the Sexually Dangerous for a term of 1 day to life. I'll try to explain this. The Massachusetts Center for the Sexually Dangerous is part of the Bridgewater State Hospital. It had a huge brouhaha after the whole mess with Nathaniel Barjona, and it was all over national news that they were setting people free who just should not have been going free. And the Plymouth County grand jury would not indict him. They came back with a no bill in the case of David Lewison in 1978 because he still hadn't recovered remains, so there wasn't any evidence. That's unusual for grand juries because there's a saying in the law that you could get an indictment on a ham sandwich when it comes to a grand jury. Apparently he wasn't even a ham sandwich. Now, for some reason, in January of 1979, they sent Andy's dental records to Chicago to be compared to the bodies found underneath John Wayne Gacy's home. I think that was a bit of a stretch. Most of Gacy's victims, first of all, were a little older than Andy. I think his youngest victims were 14, 15. But also, how would Gacy have ever gotten hold of him? I don't know that he ever went further than Illinois and Iowa. In 1979, Charles Pierce confessed to the murder of a 13-year-old female named Michelle Wilson. He's named as a suspect in the disappearance of Janice Pocket from Tolan, Connecticut, that we spoke about in an earlier show. And he's implicated in the murder of several other children in Connecticut. Again, all female in his case. Finally, in February of 1980, David Lewison's body is found in the basement of a Brockton home. No one's ever been charged in that case. Again, in that same year, the Lawrence police interrogate, which is probably the wrong word, but that's what they said, a 10-year-old boy who claims to have witnessed Andy's abduction 6 years earlier when the boy was 4 years old. I think they interviewed him. I don't think he interrogated a 10-year-old. I don't know what they got out of that because they're not saying. And nothing happened until about 1988 when Pierce confessed to the murder of a Lawrence boy, and that Lawrence boy, and the Lawrence police should investigate. Lawrence police do not question Charles Pierce. He even sent a letter, you'll see later in the timeline, and it was ignored, which I understand because his predilection was females. In October 1991, Wayne W. Chapman's Section 9 hearing, his sexually dangerous persons hearing, despite protests from several psychiatrists and the treatment center itself, Chapman is ruled no longer sexually dangerous and is released from his civil commitment, but he is returned to prison to serve the remainder of his criminal sentence. No longer sexually dangerous? Okay, I'm sorry, that doesn't make any sense to me at all. Melanie came up with the letter that Pierce had written confessing to the murder of a little boy in Lawrence. Again, I think Pierce was blowing smoke. In 2000, Montana police arrest Nathaniel Barjona, a.k.a. David Brown, in the disappearance of Zachary Ramsey. Barjona was known to have been a colleague of Wayne Chapman and knew each other before their civil commitments to the treatment center. They were both at the treatment center for the sexually dangerous. Barjona, we mentioned him briefly when we talked about Andrew Amato. He was a serial killing, child molesting cannibal. Zachary Ramsey's physical remains were never found because it is believed, and Barjona has admitted, again, Barjona's real name is David Brown. He changed it to actually consuming him. That's horrible, but it's the facts. They even have found on his property, and still don't know who they belong to, but they know they don't belong to Zachary Ramsey by DNA, bones of another child on his Montana property. The authorities in Montana were absolutely fuming when they found out exactly what this man was and that he was sent to Montana without them ever knowing who this man was and how dangerous this man was. He was sent there to live with his mother. We didn't want him, we shipped him out. There are actually interviews with Webster police. You can probably find them online from old Datelines and those type of shows at the time about Barjona, because it was such an uproar when it happened. Matter of fact, it was Melanie that found out that Barjona and Chapman were buddies. Barjona was convicted of some pretty horrible crimes. There was a documentary, again, by Melanie Perkins, who we talked about a little bit earlier, called Have You Seen Andy? There's a little picture on his poster that I made that you'll see of the cover art, I guess you'd call it. And it was broadcast on HBO Cinemax in June of 2007 and continually broadcast over the next 5 years. You can probably find it on YouTube today or Daily Motion or one of those to watch it. I highly recommend that you do. You can also go to the website, Have You Seen Andy? I believe it's haveyouseenandy.com, actually. In 2004, the city of Lawrence dedicated the corner adjacent to the Higgins Memorial Pool at Andy's apartment complex as Andy Puglisi Square. And they placed a plaque on a boulder outside of the pool that Andy and his friends played at before his disappearance. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of this. I looked everywhere for a picture of this. The only memorial ever honoring Andy was in August of 2006 when his family held a candlelight vigil at St. Patrick's Church in Lawrence. A judge rules in April of 2007. A judge rules Wayne W. Chapman is still sexually dangerous and commits him to the treatment center at Bridgewater for a term of 1 day to life. Chapman's status for release will be reviewed annually. I actually don't know what his status is at this point. I think he's deceased, but I'm not 100% sure of that. The phone number for Andy Puglisi's case, if you have any information, is the Lawrence Police Department, 978-794-5925, and they have another number as well, 978-794-5900. This case is a little more recent. Heidi Dawn Wilbur. Heidi, by the way, in this case is spelled H-E-I-D-E instead of the traditional H-E-I-D-I. She was 16 years old when she disappeared February 9th, 1991 from Middletown Springs, Vermont. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall. She weighed 100 pounds. She had blonde hair and blue eyes. You'll see in the poster that she was a striking young lady. Heidi has a dimple on her left cheek, a 1-inch scar on her forehead, and a scar on her left hand, a scar on her left wrist, and a scar on her right leg. Heidi has a tattoo of a tiger on the back of one shoulder and a tattoo of a rose on one ankle. Unfortunately, they don't provide pictures of any of this stuff. Heidi was last seen again in Middletown Springs. She was in the custody of the Department of Social and Rehabilitation Services at the time and was living in a foster home in Rutland. She got a weekend pass to go visit her family in Middletown Springs, and she may have originally run away, left on her own, and hitchhiked out of the area. But they believe that she met with foul play at some point after she left of her own volition. Which I guess is possible at 16. You're in the state care and you just don't want to be bothered anymore. Unfortunately, that's the amount of information that is available in this case. I wish there were more. You'd think that, it's sad when we have all this information about a 1976 case and 2 paragraphs, which is mostly a description in a case from 1991. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but that's the way the ball sometimes rolls. And in the Heidi Dawn Wilbur case, again, it's the Vermont State Police, but this time it's missing persons at the Shaftesbury Barracks, 802-773-9101. Paula Jean Weldon was 18 years old and in college in Bennington, Vermont at Bennington Women's College. She was a sophomore. She had worked a double shift at the dining hall at the school, went back to her room, told her roommate she was going for a walk. This is 2:45 p.m. She disappeared on December 1st, 1946. Paula was wearing a distinctive coat with a fur collar, jeans, and lightweight sneakers, which I'm sure she's somewhere on the long trail, have long since gone. The long trail was the part of the Appalachian Trail. The Appalachian Trail goes all the way from the Great Smoky Mountains all the way up to like the tip of Maine. It's one of the longest hiking trails in the country. It's up, I believe it's about 1,200 miles, I think is what I've read. I'd like to, at this time, share with you another clip with Michael C. Dooling, this time talking about Paula's case.
Paula Weldon was from Connecticut. She was from Stamford, Connecticut, and was a sophomore at Bennington College in Bennington, Vermont. And she decided she wanted to go out and explore the long trail which runs from the Massachusetts border up to the Canadian border. And I believe she probably just wanted to explore it to see where it was, and because she was a hiker and would want to go there again in the future with her friends.
It should be noted that it was a very cold day, but there was no snow on the ground, so there were no tracks to follow. She was seen by a few people, including the owner of a gas station that was right across the street from the entrance to the school. His name was Danny Fagar. And he saw her go up the side of the gravel pit across the street. And just before 3 p.m., Louis Knapp of Woodford picked her up hitchhiking on Route 67A, just outside the college entrance. His description, again, matched Weldon. The next sighting was roughly 45 minutes later in Bickford Hollow, where several residents report seeing her headed to the trail. Nobody believes she was actually going to hike the trail, but she just wanted to scout it out to hike with her friends later. That was the prevailing thought at the time, because it was so cold and she wasn't wearing shoes for hiking or anything like that. Her father arrived in Bennington and immediately organized a large group of volunteers. In fact, they closed the school so the other students could volunteer, and there was such a mess of disorganization and who was supposed to do what that the other college students were a little frustrated, as was her father. By the next evening, the college students had, again, like I said, become frustrated, and Weldon's father and the president of the university, President Jones, talked about it, and there wasn't a lot that they could do because Vermont at the time didn't have state police. This is actually the case that caused the Vermont State Police to come to be. Nothing really came of the case until 1955, when a lumberjack who'd been in Bickford Hollow near the Long Trail when she disappeared said he followed a girl, fitting her description, into the woods, and more importantly, he told friends that he knew where her body was buried. After interest in Paula's case, the man had been extensively questioned, and he admitted he'd been joking and had no knowledge of Paula or her whereabouts. That's not funny. For his part, the current director of the Vermont State Police, James W. Baker, has no particular theory on Paula's disappearance, saying that, quote, "Since I wasn't directly involved, I can't speculate on the case. However, one thing he can say definitively is the Vermont State Police came into existence because of Paula. And since their inception in 1947, they have been responsible by statute for all wilderness searches and rescue missions." Paula's father actually got the Vermont State Police created out of Paula's case because they weren't, there was so much confusion. Nobody knew who was supposed to be doing what, because all they had were, I guess, game wardens and a few local cops that just weren't prepared for a search of this magnitude. And her father, being a wealthy man, said, "We live in Connecticut. Let's bring in the Connecticut State Police." Which is, again, where that author comes in, because his father actually was a Connecticut State policeman who worked Connie's case later, but was also familiar with all of this, and that's what got this author started on this. The Vermont State Police also said states like Maine and New Hampshire have wilderness agencies do wilderness rescues. But the Vermont State Police mandated responsibility is to coordinate these searches, and this effort comes directly because of the Paula Jean Weldon case. In 2006, he was talking with the head of the State Police Search and Rescue Committee, and she had expressed interest in researching the case to put, as Baker put it, a new set of eyes on the case. So is the case cold? Technically. But they're not giving up. I think it's great that they reopened the case in 2006, 60 years after her disappearance. If you have any information in the Paula Jean Weldon case, the Vermont State Police, 802-241-5355 is the number to call. This is our special feature case. This is the case of Matthew Margulies. He was 13 years old when he was murdered in Greenwich, Connecticut. He is called Greenwich's other unsolved murder. He was killed on August 31st, 1984. He lived in Pemberwick, which is the blue-collar, sort of wrong side of the tracks section of Greenwich. This wasn't the Kennedy, Martha Moxley, gigantic houses, millions and millions of dollars part of Greenwich that everyone thinks of as Greenwich. He used to routinely go fishing off a bridge. It sounds like a very woodsy sort of area. They had rivers and bridges over rivers, and he walked down around 5 p.m. Several people saw him walking with his fishing rod, making his way up and down the river from Conley Avenue Bridge to the falls, down by the mill to go fishing around 5 p.m. As a matter of fact, he was also seen within a 1-block radius of the Sparta Deli, which is a popular hangout for what they call Valley Kids, which were the teens that lived in, again, that section of Greenwich were called Valley Kids because that was a valley. About 5:30, a young woman saw Matthew walking down Conley next to the deli. She waved out her car window, and he waved back. The last definitive sighting of Matthew. One or two thought they saw him climb into a car with one of the Valley boys. Frustratingly, this seems to be more impression than fact. Excuse me. On September 5th, Fred Lambert, a volunteer fireman who actually came home from his vacation early to help in the search, located Matthew's body. Matthew's mother had climbed up, or partway up this hill, and could smell this horrible smell. It just didn't go any further. Glad she didn't. And the police are over here, and he's over here. And he stops, leans against a tree, and looks over and sees a little shoe sticking out. He was a father of young children himself at the time, and he just, oh my God. Over here, guys, he's here. He was deflated and devastated when he found him. A criminal profile of John Douglas was actually brought in. And I have a kind of a special connection to John Douglas because he actually wrote to me on my Facebook. He became my friend on there, and he wrote to me about what I do with the missing and stuff, and he was very nice, and he told me to keep up the good work and that I do a wonderful thing, and I was just so flattered to have someone in his position, say that to me. He said the killer was a white male, familiar with Matthew and his fishing routine. He was also a classic loser with poor self-image, perhaps unkempt and overweight with a drinking problem. a drinking or drug problem. And it was chillingly clear that the killer knew the terrain. A 16-year-old boy who lived on Greenaway Drive, just a few feet up the hill from the murder site, was a suspect from the beginning. He had harassed Matthew repeatedly and pulled a knife on another boy. Most interestingly, however, he stalked and abducted a 13-year-old that very summer, luring him to a vacant apartment with the promise of soda. The victim's name was Jeff Payne. Greenwich Magazine found him, almost accidentally, and he agreed to talk publicly for the first time about the incident he feared would claim his life. To this day, it still haunts me, he said over coffee. Not really for me, but for what happened to Matt, because I think if he'd finished me off that day, Matt might still be alive. Jeff was at the playground at Hamilton Avenue School the morning that this incident happened. The boy picked him up and was going to take him for a soda. He said, wait a minute, deli's that way. He said, no, we're going to the apartment my father's fixing up. I got a cooler there, sodas for the work. And so they went, and this boy tortured him. He slammed his head into the floor after he was thrown headfirst onto the bathroom tile. They call the suspect Perry, because they're not giving out his name, which is fine. He had him lie stomach down on a strip of carpet, straddled him, and with his hand drove a nail into Jeff's back 5 times. And he said, now pull down your pants. He went to the back door to check to see if everything was fine, but the neighbor upstairs had come home. The upstairs apartment was occupied. And so he took Jeff to the backyard, hosed off his wounds. He had also cut Jeff's knee with a piece of glass. Jeff says the scar is still visible, and rode with Jeff back to Pemberwick. Perry waited to hear Jeff tell his mother he was safely home, as he'd carefully instructed him to do. Then he rode off in the direction of Greenaway Drive. When Perry was gone, Jeff broke down in tears and told his mother what had happened. His mother, Elizabeth, immediately took him to the hospital. Police were called, took Polaroids. Perry denied it, of course, but Jeff had described the place to a T, so they knew he was telling the truth. And later in the summer, when Matthew disappeared and was killed, there was no doubt in Jeff's mind that Perry had done it. I think he's an excellent suspect, and I'll tell you why in a minute. There's another completely other reason for that in my mind. There were 16 detectives on the police department, and beginning September 5th, they worked aggressively on the case. Before I go any further, I just want to say the reason why I think this Perry is a good suspect, beyond what he did to this other little boy, is because, and for some reason it's not in my notes, but Matthew's mother saw a couple of these teenage boys, who knows if one of them might have been Perry, with her son's fishing pole. Her son would have died for that fishing pole. Literally, because it was something that his late grandfather gave to him and meant the world to him. And she said that that would have been enough to get him killed, because he would not have given it up. And when she asked them, how'd you get my son's fishing pole? He gave it to us, no, he sold it to us, and she knew that that was complete and utter BS. Because his grandfather meant the world to him. He never would have done that. So it's possible that one of these boys was Perry. We may never know. Though a teen would seem likely to have lured Matthew up the hillside, Detective Gabreth believes that someone slightly older committed the murder. He bases this on a notion that a certain number of years must elapse to develop and then act on sick sexual fantasies. I don't think so. I've watched Killer Kids enough times that some of these kids have some pretty bizarre fantasies and they do act on them. Matthew was suffocated with dirt. And that was one of the things that led most folks to believe it was a younger killer. Interestingly, a man just before Christmas of that year came forward with a nagging memory. Under hypnosis, he recalled driving up Pembroke Road and passing a boy carrying a fishing pole, followed by an older, dumpy-looking boy with black hair who may have emerged from an older model green Chevy parked at the roadside. This description matches that of Perry. The time was between 5:30 and 6. Now, Perry was supposedly working at a fast food restaurant at the time, but who says he didn't leave for a few minutes? Then there was the competing story of the red pickup. I don't put much stock in that one because I think Perry did it. You know, call it tunnel vision if you will, but I think he's the best suspect. There was trace evidence, although they will not say what this trace evidence was, that they have carefully saved. And in fact, by 2002, DNA testing had eliminated several suspects. Again, they won't say which ones. I'd love to know if Perry's one of them. Interestingly, Dr. Henry Lee, renowned trace evidence expert, actually looked at all the evidence in the case, but again, he wouldn't say what exactly the evidence was. He said, "What was found at the murder site I call trace or transfer evidence. Sometimes that can be very good and you can make a connection, but I can't really discuss an active case." As in the Moxley case, there was some crucial errors made in this case by the GPD. In 1986, Police Chief Thomas Keegan, over the protests of his detective division, commissioned an outside consultant, Vernon J. Geberth, a former lieutenant commander of NYPD, to determine how the GPD handled the Margulies case, and the report was kept secret until the Freedom of Information Act suit brought by the Greenwich Times forced the town to release it in 1992. There were significant sections that had been blacked out on the order of the Superior Court Judge Harold Dean, who allowed the police to withhold the information since GPD claimed making it public would harm the Margulies investigation. That makes sense. It was revealed, however, that there was a clear lack of effective coordination in the early stages of the investigation. No detective had been assigned to check into the missing person report, even though it was a small boy. That oversight may have cost the department the ability to solve the case. Matthew never lived to see his mother happily remarried or to see his sister married and have children of her own. His mother fondly remembers that he was just getting interested in girls and began paying a little more attention to his appearance. Marion smiles when she remembers how she would catch the prepubescent preening in front of a mirror. What wonderful last memories to have of your child. They shouldn't be your last memories of your child, but what wonderful last memories to have. If you have any information in the murder of Matthew Margulies, it's the Greenwich, Connecticut Police Department at 203-622-8004. Thank you for joining us. As I said at the beginning, this is our first anniversary. I want to thank everybody that's been involved in this and made this possible, from Pat to the cable committee, the town, my parents, and all the people who have encouraged me along the way these past 10 years to do what I do. This really, truly, as I said at the beginning of the program, has been a dream come true for me, and I hope to continue it for a long time. And I want to thank you for watching. I've had so many people come up to me, more people than I ever could have imagined, come up to me in Walmart, in Hannaford's, wherever, and say, I saw your show. Really? And that's pretty cool. And that means somebody's watching. And, you know, the late great Robert Stack used to say, you could hold the key to solve a mystery, and you could. Again, thank you for joining us. God bless you. Have a wonderful and safe week. Good night.